The great scholar has lived in many times and is therefore in some degree immune from the great cataract of nonsense that pours from the press and the microphone of his own age. This is not a quote about today's world, believe it or not. This is all the way back from the middle of the 20th century. We're back with C.S. Lewis from a quote in Learning in Wartime from The Weight of Glory. This is Cole Fakes. I'm joined again by Ben Williams and Terry Fakes as we continue our second to last episode on C.S. Lewis. And in this one, we're going to deal with C.S. Lewis's day job. We may know him as a fiction writer, know him as a Christian apologist, but for the vast majority of his life, he was a scholar at both Oxford and Cambridge, and actually wrote some very interesting scholarly works. And in fact, what kept him going up until he reached kind of worldwide fame was his academic work. And guys, what I'll say is, although his academic work is not as well known today, the background, the more you read about Lewis, the background looms very large in the world of Oxford and Cambridge into who he became. I really don't think you can explain the mere Christian or even the Narnian if you don't have the Oxford Don and the Cambridge professor. That was his life. That was his world. And some of that you can see just in walking around a place like that it would fill you with a sense of beauty. But part of it is what he gave himself to study bore fruit in every endeavor that he set out to do in his life as we know him today.
I would agree with that, Cole. I think two things there. One, the fact that he's focusing on medieval literature opens the door to a number of areas. But being at Oxford and then later at Cambridge, I think just the atmosphere affected him. It's not so much that there was intellectual rigor there, although I'm sure there was. It's just the atmosphere of the place lent itself to what he was about.
We always talk about iron sharpens iron, and just being in a place where your bad ideas or half-baked ideas are shot down is good for developing a voice and being able to be more effective in what you're saying. We all need that. If you're the smartest guy in the room all the time, you get away with a lot of stuff that doesn't hold water. And so it's great to be around people that are the best critics of your work, making you the best version of yourself.
Yes, we could all use a little more striking down of our half-baked ideas. And you certainly see that in Lewis's life. He cultivates communities that do that and sharpen him and hone his craft and his writing and everything. And I think it's interesting that he's known today for these books that he's writing mostly in the second half of his life. If you think about the Chronicles of Narnia, Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, these are kind of after Lewis has become established around World War II. But even before that, he was putting out quite a few articles and monographs that had a more scholarly bent. But this peaked really when he went to Cambridge, kind of the summation of his whole academic life. When he was at Cambridge from 1954 to 1963, he wrote 13 books, 44 articles, and 3 collections of essays. That's a pretty good output in the last 10 years of your professional life.
But before the era of publisher perish, he was already doing his bit.
And the great thing is he was doing this all on a typewriter. He never learned to,
Right.
I guess he was writing it out and having somebody type it out for him on a typewriter. He never learned to type. I think one of the most interesting pieces of Lewis's work is the abolition of man. And the reason for that is, if you think about Lewis as primarily a teacher, if you go back to our second episode where we talk about Lewis's conversion, his professional life, he's lecturing, he's a tutor. He's actually not even a full professor. He's tutoring and giving lectures to undergrads. And he develops a very keen sense of what you're trying to do when you're educating someone. And this goes hand in hand with his scholarly work. In the essay, The Abolition of Man, he talks about what is education for. And this offers a really interesting glimpse into Lewis. He is Augustinian in the sense that he believes education is about the ordering of your loves, that there's a lot more than just filling your head with knowledge. You're trying to inculcate and practice certain virtues. Of course, this, before the modern era, before John Dewey, this was just called education. Now we call it classical education. But the goal of education was essentially to create a certain kind of person. This is as old as Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas. And I would imagine this started in his life. Really, I think the thing that made him the scholar that he was the time he spent with Kirkpatrick, or as he calls him, the Great Knock, when he was a teenager. And he's being tutored. He is talking, discussing, he's reading the classics. He says in Surprised by Joy that the only two kinds of talk I wanted were the almost purely imaginative and the almost purely rational. At the time, of course, he's reading Cicero and Demosthenes, Herodotus, Virgil, all these great authors, and he's developing an appetite for the life of study. And in this essay, in The Abolition of Man, he calls the root of this the Tao, or the Tao, which is essentially the way things are. We'd kind of call it truth with a capital T, something that's in common to all great classic works of literature that we cannot neglect. He writes, it is the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes really are true and others really are false, to the kind of thing the universe is and the kinds of things we are. So he has this kind of general sense of teaching truth, becoming a certain kind of person, developing character. And the indictment in The Abolition of Man is that we are educating now, so think 1950s on, we're educating a group of people that their heads are filled with knowledge, but they are, as Lewis famously is quoted now, men without chests. And what that means is we've got the head part, we've got the rational part, but we don't have the virtue, the courage, the attributes that you want in a person part of things. And so his indictment at the end of that essay is pretty damning, that we have people that know stuff, but actually don't have the courage to put it into practice.
Well, that makes me want to ask you the question, do you get any sense out of that book that he's anti-technology? Because that head, filling your head with facts, was really driven by technological improvement. But did that make him an anti-technology guy?
He certainly was an anti-technology guy. He's a self-proclaimed Luddite in certain ways. He doesn't drive, as we mentioned, he doesn't type. He's hesitant about technology. I certainly think that he would be against technology in education. I think one of the interesting quotes in The Abolition of Man is he says, you can hardly open a periodical without coming across the statement that what our civilization needs is more, quote, drive, dynamism, creativity. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and then demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. That to me does speak to the way that we try to microwave or produce, manufacture education for test results, or kind of however you'd want to measure that, without taking into consideration the most important thing that you can teach a person to become, a healthy member of society is what Lewis calls the chest, the virtue, the ability to do it.
Well, he certainly seems prescient in the sense that, looking from our perspective today, I hear you saying that he was predicting that the pursuit of that kind of knowledge, that one of the casualties would be morality and a sense of civic responsibility. And I would say in that regard, it's proved to be true.
Mm-hmm. And it's something that, to me, the reason I mentioned this first is this is not an academic work of his. It's more cultural criticism, as you're saying, but it frames much of his academic work. I mean, he devoted himself to a study and a style that was fully embodied. That's one of the things we've been talking about with Lewis is it's not just intellect for intellect's sake. It is also imagination and intuition and desire and love and the cultivation of the whole person. This is not going to come as a surprise to our listeners. That's because his head was buried in texts that taught all of those things all day, every day. The reason the Narnia books are what they are is because they reflect the kind of formation that Lewis himself had, which is not this kind of technological, get your easy way out, just try to be more efficient, but instead a whole person education to develop men with chests, men and women with chests.
For me, Cole, probably kind of moving on from that, you setting the framework. For me, the first thing I read that I understood to be academic work, and I don't know if I would make a strong case for this, but maybe the pinnacle to me of his academic analysis was his preface to Paradise Lost. That's the first thing I read that was clearly academic. And I thought, okay, this is characteristic of his academic work. And would you agree with that? Or how did you come to his academic works?
Terry, I had the same experience that it's definitely something you read and you think this is him in his element.
Hmm.
I'll give you two counter examples to then come back around to Paradise Lost, but you can tell when a guy gets a little bit out of their element. When you read uh, Richard Dawkins on zoology, he sounds like a very clever fellow. When he gets into philosophy, you can tell you weren't trained in philosophy, were you? That you're outside of your academic wheelhouse. And then even an example I like, I'm a big fan of G.K. Chesterton, and I enjoyed Everlasting Man, which is his rendition of the history of humanity. But you can also tell in there at various places, this is a illustrator and a journalist. He's not a historian. Like he's kind of outside of his own academic wheelhouse. When you read Lewis, especially in Paradise Lost, you can tell this is just where he eats. This is his strength. He knows this front and back. He knows the contours and the nuance in a way I didn't even know what questions to ask. If you had asked me write a preface to Paradise Lost, I would Google Milton and tell you when he was born. But Lewis goes back and he's going to start with, well, first we've got to understand Homer and Virgil and the difference between the two, and makes this case that's so robust that clearly only a guy well versed in that could make.
Well, I agree. I thought when I started into it, like you said, he starts out with a discussion of epic and epic poetry and oral poetry and that sort of thing, and then makes the distinguishing characteristic between primary epic, to where he would place Beowulf and the Iliad of Homer, for example, and secondary epic, who I think Virgil's Aeneid was his example. But if I remember correctly, he would put Paradise Lost in that second category. But it might be helpful just to know, how did he define those categories?
Yeah, he talks a lot about the works, particularly of Homer and that era of being the primary epic, or that is, it's a more familiar type of epic. The what's at stake is a man's life and his family. So if you read the Odyssey, the cosmos doesn't cave in if Odysseus doesn't make it home.
Right.
It's just his life and his virtue at stake and his family at stake. He touches on bigger themes because he, in his journeys, comes in contact with the gods in this enchanted world. But really, all that's at stake is one man's journey. Whereas with Virgil, you read the Aeneid, if it doesn't play out, there's no Rome. The Western civilization falls. Like everything ceases to exist. It's much bigger. And Lewis, interestingly enough, seems to favor the primary epic. Like he kind of likes the more familiar tale. When you read Narnia, it's much more primary. It's about, will this child do the right thing in this setting, and what will be the result of that. Whereas, yeah, Paradise Lost, Milton is doing a Christian version of the secondary epic. How did the cosmos come to look in the way that how did the story play out of the fall of man? And so it's a Christian rendition of a Virgil style epic. Well, again, who would have noticed that besides Lewis to make that
Right.
niche a description? He also does a great job of dealing with the criticisms of Milton. That again, you'd have to be well versed enough that he's having dialogue with other people who have written about Milton, and he's doing it in a very coherent way. Is Milton unorthodox? Is he heretical? What are his own views of the Trinity? Are his views of the Trinity found in other works? Are his views of the Trinity found in other works also present in Paradise Lost? A very specific chain of questions that he can go through really well. Probably one of my favorite discussions, oddly enough, is the chapter about Satan, uh, because Satan in Paradise Lost is the most fleshed out character, more than Adam and Eve, more than the Son of God or the Father on the throne or any of the angels. Satan's the most fleshed out character. In the era of the American Revolution, Paradise Lost became very popular with some of the founding fathers. We actually have one of the museums has the copy of Paradise Lost that boy, Madison and Jefferson passed back and forth. Their signatures are in, and they would sign it every time they read it, and their signatures are just all over, and they passed it back and forth between them. And for them, the idea of Satan is a character casting off imperial rule. Better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. And they found something interesting about that. They being maybe two of the least Christian influenced of the founding fathers. So Lewis tackles then the question of, well, what do we do with this Satan character? And he comments, this isn't that Milton is super fascinated with Satan. He just says it's always easier to write a bad character than a good one, because it's really easy to imagine yourself gone to seed, like all your worst traits unrestrained. It's easy to write that character. Whereas I think the quote from Lewis is, it's very hard to imagine a person better than yourself. Like, how would that person live and act, and how do you write him well? How does he speak? How is he believable? Because we aren't good. I mean, if we were good, we could write good characters, but we're not. And so we find wicked characters easier to write. Again, very insightful way of handling a story that seems to make Satan its main character, and it clearly isn't.
I agree with that. That was my favorite section of Lewis's book. When I read Paradise Lost, you could tell that Satan is a major character, but he was so insightful as he looked at Milton's poem. I'll give you one quote, which is very academic and a very insightful analysis. But here's how he sums up Satan's character. He says, what we see in Satan is the horrible coexistence of a subtle and incessant intellectual activity with an incapacity to understand anything. Satan's doom has been brought upon himself. In order to avoid seeing one thing, he has almost voluntarily incapacitated himself from seeing it all. And thus, throughout the poem, all of his torments come, in a sense, at his own bidding, and the divine judgment might have been expressed in the words, "Thy will be done." I thought that was an interesting insight into Satan and an interesting commentary on fallen humanity as well.
Probably my final remark on the Paradise Lost preface. How do you know that a guy has done a very good job of introducing a work? I wanted to read it at the end. After I finished the preface to Paradise Lost, I went and got a copy of Paradise Lost. I was excited about Lewis's source material. I mean, I picked it up kind of as an assignment, feeling like I probably should read this before we podcast, and then ended up reading Paradise Lost as well, just out of enthusiasm. Well, that's a guy who can make his source material exciting to you, and then make you enjoy it when you read it. That's good commentary. That's good writing. And Lewis, at least in this instance, did it for me, because I picked it up and read it. I went camping the following weekend after I read Paradise Lost preface, and I'm sitting by the campfire pouring through Paradise Lost by Milton, and my kids think I'm gone mad, and I'm like, oh, this is great. I didn't know it was so good.
Well, sign it, give it to Cole, and he'll sign it and give it back.
That'd be good.
It is the sign of a great author to be able to take something as monumental as Paradise Lost and enhance it. Right. Usually if you're writing about something that good, it's like, hey, I'd rather read the real thing. But right. to be able to comment on it, introduce it, and then segue the reader into it is really one of the marks, I think, of Lewis's genius. And Ben, as you mentioned earlier, one of the things I like about discussing his scholarly work is you see him at home in his native land, and you realize that the well runs very deep with Lewis, and the themes that he's discussing in Paradise Lost, the intro preface to Paradise Lost, it appears other places, but you get it in its distilled form in some of his scholarly work. And I think it was Barfield or one of the Inklings that said about Lewis, you can see everything that he believes. Anything that he believes, you can see somewhere in everything that he's written, something along those lines. That he's one of those people that's just so thoroughly saturated with what it is that he's about and what he loves that you can take the scholarly work and then see a glimpse of it in, Out of the Silent Planet, or, you can take his reflections on the Psalms and see it in Screwtape. I mean, he's just universal in the sense of his consistency and his interest. Another work where that's really true is The Four Loves, which is maybe not his most scholarly work, but certainly one where he's starting to flex his muscles a little bit as a scholar.
Oh, I agree with that, Cole. It's one of my favorites of his, and I've read it several times. You're right. He's not commenting on an existing work, and it's not scholarly in the sense that he's interacting with other scholars. So I would say it's not an academic work. But what you see is just the power of his thought process as he thinks things through. The Four Loves was published in 1960, and it came from a series of radio talks from 1958 to 1960. And so obviously this was something that's understandable to regular people. And it's interesting to watch him think through this. It's almost like you get a glimpse into his own mind. He starts out in the book by talking about love relationships and saying, I want to explore the relationships of love and its many-sided facets. He starts and he analyzes it, and he said, think about an infant and a mom. The infant loves the mom, but in a way that has need in it. The infant needs the mom. Flip it around. Mother loves the child, but not in a needy way, more in a giving way. Love can be a need, it can be a gift. And then he changes entirely and he says, but there has to be at least another kind of love, and that is the love of beauty. He calls it appreciative love. You just love something because of what it is. Then he goes and models the rest of the book on the 4 Greek words for love. And so you have storge, which is affection, and he sees that as a family kind of love, a parent-child type love. You have eros, which is romantic love. Charity, which is agape, which we as Christians are familiar with that. And that is a love that does not regard circumstances. We would call it unconditional love. And then the fourth is one that's really underrated. It's philia, and it's friendship. And it's also translated love, but it's a different kind of love. And that's the one that really struck me the most, is the other loves are present in our world. Obviously, affection, family affection, obviously eros, probably taken far, far too seriously in our culture. Charity, the highest ideal of unconditional love. But Lewis says this about friendship. He says, to the ancients, friendship seemed the happiest and most fully human of all loves, the crown of life and the school of virtue. The modern world, in comparison, ignores it. And one of the reasons is that we need affection, obviously, to raise children. We need eros, or none of us would have been born. He says, but friendship isn't essential. It's a blessing. It's a gift. And I thought a lot about his reasoning on the idea of why friendship should be a higher value. And I think his thinking on that influenced the friendships in his life as well.
Yeah, Lewis famously said that, friendship starts out when you look over and say, oh, you too. And you realize that you're not the only person that has this interest. And we certainly have lost some of that. I mean, there's a lot of cultural commentary on this right now that people don't have the deep-seated friendships that they used to, and associations are going down, civic groups, going down. But Lewis was someone who had rich friendships. And as you're discussing that, it makes me think of the influence on the Inklings on Lewis's life. not just on his scholarly work, but just on the person that he was. And we mentioned the Inklings in an earlier episode, but I wanted to read this description of the Inklings. That's actually Warney, who attended a lot of the meetings of the Inklings, wrote this in a memoir about C.S. Lewis. He says, the ritual of an Inklings meeting was unvarying. When half a dozen or so had arrived, tea would be produced. And when the pipes were alight, Jack would say, well, has anybody got anything to read us? Out would come a manuscript, and we would settle down to sit in judgment upon it. Real unbiased judgment, too, since we were no mutual admiration society. Praise for good work was unstinted, but censure for bad work, or even not so good work, was often brutally frank. To read to the Inklings was a formidable ordeal. As you can imagine, these Oxford professors and novelists and different people that they wrapped into this group, it would be because they weren't afraid to speak honestly with each other, which is one of the themes of friendship that you've been detailing. Lewis loved this kind of thing. And I think that's part of the beauty of who he was. He was not afraid to give criticism and not afraid to receive criticism. And so you look at the Inklings and you realize that Lewis's space trilogy, The Great Divorce, Miracles, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Charles Williams' All Hallows Eve, even Warney, some of Warney's work, Owen Barfield's verse drama Medea, all went through the ringer of the Inklings before they saw the light of day as printed material. And I dove into this a little bit in this great, great book. I don't know if you guys looked into this one at all, but The Fellowship, The Literary Lives of the Inklings by Philip and Carol Zaleski, all about the different lives of the Inklings. It's just a fantastic book. And they talk about, there's a little bit of a mythology as to how the Inklings actually started. As you'd kind of imagine, it's now shrouded in mystery. But one that they present is that actually predated, the society predated Lewis and Tolkien. There was a guy named Edward Lean, who was an Oxford undergraduate who had published 2 novels. And in 1932, he started inviting people into this group. Another one is that actually in the late 20s, there were some conversations going on that Lewis and Barfield and some others got engaged with. And regardless of how it started, what they point to is the innovative piece of the Inklings was kind of twofold. One, that they were reading unpublished compositions. These were works in progress. This wasn't you prepared a paper and here you are bringing your polished material to the Inklings, but it was stuff that you were in the middle of working on, which gives it the better chance of being really good when it's done. And then 2, that there was immediate criticism of it. So people's gut instinct, you're not loading up, necessarily the week before with all these kinds of things that you've looked up, but you're giving immediate back and forth and having to respond to it. And they point to those 2 things as really being the X factors of what made the Inklings so great. And I think it shaped all the people in the Inklings to be better than they were. In fact, I'll read a quote they include from The Four Loves, where Lewis talks about this. He says, in each of my friends, there's something that only some other friend can fully bring out. By myself, I'm not large enough to call the whole man into activity. I want other lights than my own to show all of his facets. We possess each friend not less, but more as the numbers of those with whom we share him increases. That was really profound. Speaking to the way friendship works.
Oh, I agree. And you definitely see that working in the Inklings. I also read some of the book that you were talking about, Cole, where I learned a little more about each of them and their personalities, and they were very different. And it would be easy for them to dislike each other. And yet they had a base of friendship that was greater than whether they approved or disapproved of any particular piece of writing. And it is interesting, especially looking at Lewis and Tolkien and their interaction with the others, because I probably know Lewis and Tolkien the best, that each of them brought out different things in their friends. And it was interesting to me to see how much Tolkien brought out of Lewis and vice versa. I think that quote is really observant of him to realize that that kind of group of friends brings things out you couldn't get any other way. And I wish we did more of it in our modern culture. I think we'd be richer for it.
The era of the echo chamber and of the cancel culture has
Mm.
impoverished us to be able to grow from opposition, from virtuous opposition. We demonize the adversary and then avoid them, and so we don't have that benefit that Lewis clearly both had, valued, and expressed so well.
I can't let us get through a whole podcast series here without a brief mention of Winston Churchill. At this exact same time, actually, as the Inklings are beginning to form, Churchill is forming the other club, and this is something in the ethos of Britain at this time period, and I would assume in certain ways in America as well, but certainly in Britain in the 30s, 40s, 50s, these dinner clubs, social clubs that could span ideological divides, that was actually a feature rather than a bug. They realized that if you could have people that have differing enough perspectives, but the same kind of commitment to the group and to charity and discussion and not taking yourself too seriously, you could actually have a lot better discussion. So if you think about all the things that they discussed, you'd almost need people that were from different backgrounds, different scholarly disciplines, different opinions on things to generate that much conversation for that long. So the other club, for example, has people from both major parties, people in
Hmm.
the nobility, not artists, not writers. I mean, anything you can imagine, they probably had somebody at some point come because they realized that if we don't get all wrapped up in making sure that this person sees things exactly the way I do, which is not to minimize that there are some very important non-negotiable things, it will actually make for a lot better conversation.
That's true. And for Lewis, given that all of the Inklings were writers and many of them were scholars, they brought a level of expertise to that particular thing that they were doing. Whereas they disagreed on other things, but they all had in common a sense of love and expertise to writing. And I can't help but think that made all of his work better, not just his fiction, but probably his academic writing as well.
Mm-hmm. The work that I picked for us to discuss is The Discarded Image. This is not one that I was familiar with before we started on this podcast series, but it was published in its present form posthumously, but it is basically lectures that Lewis gave several times at Oxford. So, Prolegomena to Medieval Studies and Prolegomena to Renaissance Studies, which is a mouthful and something you don't want to see on your registrar as a freshman going into these. But that's what they were. They were intro courses for people who were going to pursue either Renaissance or medieval studies. And I think McGrath actually makes an interesting point about this. The fact that Lewis is a professor of medieval and Renaissance studies is in itself kind of a glimpse into Lewis's scholarly life because those are not natural partners in a
Right.
chair of scholarship. They're actually very different. What Lewis did was he came up with this model. In fact, these lectures are really about developing this model. We'd probably call it a worldview that is common amongst the literature of this period. And he's analyzing that in these lectures. And it's a combo of philosophy, art, science, that their whole vision of the world was characterized by certain qualities. And what Lewis points to is it was characterized by the view that everything had a place. There's a nature in everything because God has created it that way. There's an order to the universe, and to the way things should work. God is at the top of the model, and everything is kind of deriving its purpose and existence from him. And so you have this systematic approach to the way that things work. And if you read any literature from this time period, you realize this is true. I mean, Thomas Aquinas is exhausting in his ordering, and the scholastic way of writing derives
Hmm.
from this worldview that actually the universe was created to work a certain way. There's a logical way that we should examine things and talk about things. Everything has its place, everything has its order. There's a love of systems. There's a bookishness, people just commenting on books, commenting on books, commenting on books, as opposed to coming up with these new generative ideas. He says, characteristically, medieval man was not a dreamer nor a spiritual adventurer. He was an organizer, a codifier, a man of systems. His ideal could be not unfairly summed up in the old housewifely maxim, a place for everything and everything in its right place. He says you can see the exemplars of this mindset in things like cathedrals and the way they're designed, the Summa by Aquinas, and the Divine Comedy. I mean, if you think about the Divine Comedy for a minute, all the rings are one thing, but then all the
Right.
sections within all the circles and rings, and all the people that are arranged exactly just right by Dante in the levels of the circles and rings. I mean, it is an exhaustive way of approaching things, and that's indicative of this mindset. So he says the comedy, the Divine Comedy, which is, I suppose, the supreme achievement, crowded and varied as a railway station on a bank holiday, but patterned and schematized as a battalion in a ceremonial parade, is his description of Dante's work. That's indicative of this mindset, is that there's a fixed order to things. And it reminds me of Lewis, but it really reminds me of the hobbits in the Hobbits, in the
Right.
opening chapters of Lord of the Rings. It says that hobbits love nothing more than to tell of things written down in books that they already know, and to discuss things like old family genealogies and things that everybody's already familiar with. This is kind of that medieval mindset. It's not simplistic, it's just ordered. And for Lewis, he's going to say at the end of this work, he actually loves the old way of doing things. He loves the old vision of the world because it represents a security and a place and an order of things. And a lot of that comes out in his other works. I mean, if you think about something even like Mere Christianity, it's a distillation of things that have come before. It's not an original work by any means. He's not doing exploring theology for the new era. He's trying to get back to what is most central, kind of the least common denominator of what we all know about Christianity, and let's work from there.
Well, that's really interesting because you can tell his love for that. And it's interesting as you trace that through his work. But at the same time, you made this observation that he was also professor of Renaissance literature. And in a lot of ways, the Renaissance was a rebellion against that scholastic mode of thinking. And so it does make for a strange bedfellow. But Ben, it seems to me that his work probably also has some of that dynamism of the Renaissance mindset as well, that's not so concerned with ordering and maybe pushing new frontiers.
Yeah, he definitely dabbled in a lot of different areas. The book I picked to talk about a section of is Christian Reflections, which is edited by his biographer Hooper, but it's a collection of his essays. And just to read the table of contents for this collection of essays gives you the sense that this is a Renaissance man. This is a guy definitely well versed in his area, but able to speak competently on a lot of topics. Just the table of contents, if I may: Christianity and literature, Christianity and culture, religion, ethics, the poison of subjectivism, the chapter I want to talk about, the funeral of a great myth, but then a chapter on church music, historicism, the Psalms, the language of religion, petitionary prayer, modern theology, and biblical criticism. I mean, that's a pretty broad range of things to think you could talk about, and yet you don't read any of them and think, wow, he's out of his depth. He clearly speaks of them like a student of literature would speak of them, but he does so competently, and it's just really impressive. The one that has meant a lot to me personally is The Funeral of a Great Myth, where he dives into the area of science. He himself is not interested in the science. And in fact, he's going to speak of the doctrine or the theory of evolution. And he's willing to say it may turn out that science wins out to show that this is a very viable explanation of things. He says, I just don't know. I'm not a biologist, essentially. That's not his area of interest. But his claim is that as a student of literature, he can make a claim about evolution that the biologist can't. And that is that he can see the cultural imagination of modern literature running ahead of the science, and then the science being captured by the modern imagination and reflecting that. So again, in the same way he can say Homer is different from Virgil, he can say Renaissance and before that medieval literature is different than modern literature. And modern literature has the theme of emergence, development, and evolution in it before origin of the species.
Hmm.
And so he starts quoting from Wagner. He once talked about Keats. This is his favorite bit he really wants to hit on. So on our heels a fresh perfection treads, a power more strong in beauty, born of us and fated to excel us as we pass in glory that old darkness. It's Keats' Hyperion. He says, we were saying things like that before the science got there. And then that imaginative seed planted in our head by modern literature, the modern era of literature, science then conformed to it. We wanted to believe that things were progressing incrementally and getting better, that the future would be better than the past. We wanted to believe that. That's the modern ideal. He was criticizing modernism before it was cool, and saying that was an idea wrapped up in modernism so tightly that science was just bound to conform to it. And he has this great line, I guess every age gets the science it desires, which is a terrifying thought to a scientist. Like, it's not supposed to work that way. But he says, oh no, the poets were there first.
That's really interesting to me, Ben. I had not read that, and that idea really resonates with me because coming out of the Renaissance, if you think about it, it seems to me there are two tracks. One is romanticism, which I'll just leave that aside for a minute. But the other is a very strong humanism. One of the reactions against the scholastic mindset that Cole was talking about was our authority doesn't reside in a higher power who's ordered things. We order things, that the supremacy of the human being. And so, what you're reading there is the idea that we are what progress is built on, which leads into that evolutionary idea. And I never really thought about the connection between the science of evolution being built on an intellectual climate, if you will, of evolution. That's a really fascinating connection.
Yeah, it was a game changer for me. And speaking of progress, I'll apologize. My neighbor has decided this is a good time to mow his yard. So if there's some background noise, there's some progress going on outside. But it really informed the way I think about science of even when you read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution, the idea that science takes a shape, that science is done by humans, and humans are imagining and thinking about the way things are shaped. And then you get this collection of data and we draw a picture, but the picture is an imaginative process. And he does just such a good job of outlining that. He also anticipates the intellectual argument that I think I'm more familiar with in Alvin Plantinga's Where the Conflict Really Lies. The question of, can I trust my brain if it's the product of evolution? Well, in this same essay, he has this line, unless you start by believing that reality in the remotest space and the remotest time rigidly obeys the laws of logic, you have no ground for believing in astronomy, any biology, any paleontology, any archaeology. To reach the positions held by the real scientist, which are then taken over by the myth, you must in fact treat reason as absolute. But at the same time, the myth asks me to believe that reason is simply the unforeseen and unintended byproduct of a mindless process at one stage of its endless and aimless becoming. Well, I would read that much later in Plantinga, and that becomes a very fashionable argument for Christian apologists today. I don't know if I can think of any place I can find it before Lewis. And he just has, again, kind of a throwaway paragraph where he's talking about evolutionary thought from a mythical point of view, in the same way he does Christianity. Again, remember, myth isn't a bad word for Lewis. He just means we probably use the word more worldview. It's a pattern of thought, a shape of thought, more than just individual premises. And for him, he says there are some real problems to the myth of evolution, regardless of the science. And in that way, I think it's way ahead of his time. It's called The Funeral of a Great Myth because he acknowledges that he kind of liked it. As a younger man, he found it captivating, and now he has to bury it because while it was a riveting idea, it turns out to be false, and the true myth, as we've heard in so many places, is Christianity.
It's interesting he says that there because he says something similar in the discarded image. He says, I have made no serious effort to hide the fact that the old model delights me, as I believe that it delighted our ancestors. The constructions of the imagination seem to me have combined splendor, sobriety, coherence in the same degree. But it is possible that some readers have long been itching to remind me that it had one serious defect. It is not true. And in a similar way, yes, the myth is there, the model is there, but there's some things missing. And Ben, I'd actually put a note here next to this because I knew you might bring up Thomas Kuhn. There is some predating even of Kuhn, maybe by a decade here by Lewis, because he's talking about the the models. They reveal the prevailing winds and philosophies of the age, as you've just been mentioning, and that was the same in the Renaissance and the Middle Ages as it is today. And at some point, the model wears out, but it takes a long time for people to rise up and throw the model off in what Kuhn would call a paradigm shift. The myth or the model often outpaces its usefulness. And that actually, I think, is one of the really interesting parts of Lewis as a scholar, is that he has a little bit of measured distance from whatever the prevailing model seems to be. And I think one of the reasons that Lewis has such a lasting impact on the world is because he isn't just parroting all the stuff that was popular in the 1940s and 50s in Britain. He's actually retrieving and combining things that have been true for a very, very long time and have worn through different eras and popularity. And he's able to get down to the bedrock of what is real and what is true and what is lasting, which reminds me of his phrase that's quoted a lot of times now, chronological snobbery, which is something that in Surprised by Joy, he brings up that he had to be freed from. And he defines it as the uncritical acceptance of the intellectual climate common to our own age and the assumption that whatever has gone out of date is on that account discredited. It's funny to think of Lewis being a chronological snob, but in his early life, he was, and Barfield and others shook that out of him. Later in life, he seems completely immune to it, and that's one of his very great qualities, is that he is not enamored by what's happening now. He's fixated on what is eternally true.
I'm fond of Jacobs, who wrote the book Breaking Bread with the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an idea that its time has come to come back, of reading old works, and not necessarily he read old works the same way he had friends he didn't always agree with. Right? He could read an old book, he didn't agree with every page of it, but to engage it and to think about it, and then to realize there's a reason that was a classic of its time, and so I need to engage it. And likewise today, you can't cancel Aristotle, and you can't get rid of Lewis because you don't like some element of what he wrote. You have to go back and engage those guys and say, why are they there? And they actually insulate you against the winds of mood, of the spirit of the age, that you have an anchor. You don't have to agree with them, but there's a reason those ideas have been bedrock for century, in some case millennia. And Lewis just is persistent in engaging that again and again and finding value that he brings forward. There's a poorly and rarely quoted line from Jesus, I believe in Matthew, when he says, in his kingdom, there will be scribes who bring forth from of old treasures old and new, right? That there's something about digging into the past and what's there and bringing something forward that just has permanent value.
I agree with that. And I think that's one of his great contributions is we live in a time where even the deepest truths of our culture have become a matter of fashion. It is fashionable to think this. It is now no longer fashionable to think that. And Lewis, I think, reminds us, Cole, that these ideas, these enduring ideas, and the continuity of us as cultures and as peoples have to be rooted in something deeper than fashion. And to do that, we have to have a conversation with those who've gone before us.
Yes, I think that's part of the key of Lewis's transcendent interest into today. I mean, in the first podcast, we talked about his books are actually more popular now than they were in his lifetime. He is just gaining popularity with time. And I think that's because he does cut against the grain of what is fashionable and what is transient. There's something admirable in Lewis that does touch on what is permanent and what is eternal. And so as we wrap up his scholarly pursuits and Lewis as a scholar, in the next episode, we'll conclude the series by talking about what is it exactly that has kept Lewis so relevant, even though his world has passed away? What is it that's made him so enduringly interesting and long lasting, especially in American evangelicalism, something that Lewis would have been very surprised about? What is it that has made Lewis the patron saint of evangelicalism today? We will deal with that in the final episode next time on the So We Speak podcast.